Welcome back to our series on reforms. This is going to be the third video. In this video, we are going to define reform and we're going to understand what is a reform. By definition, a reform is an act that is intended to influence or impact a specific culture. Now, note the highlighted word there: act, impact, and culture. Okay, and let me go back. Every reform has a source and a target. So we're going to define all those highlighted words there: act, impact, culture, source, and target. And that's what we're going to do in this video. Now, reform is anything you do, any act. Your act can be a speech, it can be a policy, it can be a behavior, it can be a gesture, it can be a teaching, or you can use a symbol. So it's any act that you intend to influence somebody or the culture, a particular culture. For example, if you talk to your child at home, you're trying to change something from, that's a reform. If you, whatever you do to try to make a change, that's a reform. So we're going to, based on that, we're going to, so I've defined act. Act is anything that could be policy, it could be speech, it can be a gesture, it can be body language, it can be a value. Whatever you try to do to influence is a culture, very important culture. Now, let's define impact. Impact is, that's the aim of any reform. You want to have an impact. Now, there are three types of impact you can get from a reform. You can have a positive impact, which is solid. You can, any positive impact, any positive reform, we call it reformation. So I just want to get information. Anything that is positive, that has a positive influence, is called a reformation. A reform can also have a negative influence, which is a negative reform. I'll give some examples as we go on. Then a reform can be transparent, which means it doesn't make any change. It doesn't change the culture. It just, you have a reform which doesn't have any impact. Okay, so now let's define culture. The culture is the most important thing in any reform because that is what you are trying to impact. You want to change the culture. So culture is a way of life of a group of people. It's the way you do things. Now you have all kinds of cultures. You can apply culture to the society. You can also apply culture to the church. So you have church culture. You have society culture. Now, since we broke down the society into segments, you can also have structure based on each segment. For example, I can have art culture, business culture. I can have Catholic culture, Baptist culture, you know. Each segment has its own culture. So the culture will shape anybody's worldview. So if I say art culture, I can also have art worldview. So they have their own way of seeing things in the art segment, in art sphere. Now, the culture includes what? It includes behaviors and elements just as language, doctrine, musical style, dressing, food, customs, or what you call traditions, gestures. All those are culture based, those are elements of culture in any segment. So for a particular sphere, you have different culture. So, and that is the thing when you are evangelizing, and you see why we really need to emphasize on culture, because it's the culture you are trying to impact. So that you see from the definition of reform, it is the culture you try to impact. Culture is the most dominant element in reform, because that's what you want to influence. So when Christians go out to evangelize, the thing they battle with the most in the society is the culture. Because you're trying to change a culture, you're trying to influence a culture, bringing church culture to impact on society culture. So culture is the most important thing in, and that's why some people they don't define reforms properly. Like if I use I can use rod. If I use, I'm going to explain this more in details when we start talking specific reforms. Let me just keep on to that. So we also said that there is a source and there's a target for every reform. So the reform is coming from a source and it has a target who you want to talk to. Now, since we defined church and society, you can see that we can have 4 different types of reforms now based on the source and the target. You can have, the source can be the church to church. So you can have reform within the church, which means from church to church, and it can be across church. I explain that too. Then you can have a reform in the society, from society to society. Those are what we call social reforms. Reforms from church to church, we call it spiritual reforms. Then you can have reform coming from the society into the church. Like you try to bring society culture into the church culture. That is called syncretic reforms. Okay. Then you also have reform that can come from the church to the society, which is what Christ wants us to do. And that's the most important reform. We're going to talk more about that. From the church to the society is called missionary reforms. So we're going to be talking about all these 4 types of reform. Let's look at the graphical representation of these reforms. Now, spiritual reforms, which is church to church. You see that I showed the reforms in circle. So when you have a circle, inside the circle that's from church to church. It can be a Methodist reform inside Methodist. But you see also you can be a circle across to another circle, which means it can be a reform from Methodist to Pentecostal. So you can have that. It's possible. Having reforms within the church, but everything is still within the church. But you can have reform across. So when you have reforms within the church, you call it spiritual reform. Whether it's from Methodist to Anglican, or we call everything spiritual reforms. Now you see one this a little bit darkened circle here. I put it outside the church because that's when a church is spiritually declined, which means there are some things they are not doing the right thing, although they say it's a church. So we cannot put them inside the church. There is no longer a church, so it should be outside. It's part of the society. Some of past spiritual reform we have is like Lutheran Reformation by Martin Luther, missionary reformation, which is the current one. When you have a spiritual revival, that's also spiritual reforms. We're going to talk more about this in future. Social reforms, that's reforms within the society. Now, you can have, again, we broke down the society into different segments. Social reforms, some of them, example, are human rights activity. Those are social reforms. Racism is a social, although it's a negative social reform. Fascism is also a negative social reforms. Most reforms are usually like government policies, they have education reforms. So that will be from government to education. For example, I said you can also have reforms in the social, where from one segment to another. For example, government to education, government to art and culture. I give you an example of pure social reform. Pure social reform means it's within the same sphere. For example, let's say MBA. The MBA commissioner now decide that we're going to shift the 3-point line backward. That is pure social reforms. That is, it's a social reform within the same sphere. But you can also have mixed social reforms. For example, the government having a policy on family issues. That's a mix. That's across spheres. Syncretic reforms. Syncretic reforms. Okay, I need to mention that you can have negative, positive, and transparent reforms on each of them, whether it's social reforms, whether it's spiritual reforms. So you can have a total of 12 types of reform because you can have positive, negative, and transparent for each of the 4 types of reforms, so making 12. Syncretic reforms are reforms that come from the society to church. Now, again, you have to note that what we're talking about is culture, not just anything from the society to the church. You are bringing a culture from the society, you are trying to impact it on the church. That is called syncretic. Actually, this term syncretic was developed to describe African churches when they bring some of their traditional culture into the church. But that is not only Africa, because syncretic has started right from the beginning of the church. All those what you call the heresies, the false prophets, they are all syncretic because most heresies they bring some kind of outside things into the church, and that's what anything you bring to the church from outside culture to the church is syncretic. Heresy, corruption, false prophecy. You can actually have music. You can bring some kind of music into the church which is syncretic, which means this music is a culture for a particular people, but you are bringing it into the church. Now, syncretic reforms can be, if it's solid, which means look at this in this figure, you see that the arrow is pointing, is coming from the society, is going to the church, and you see the overlap. That's what you need to see. The overlap is the society, which means this is a solid syncretic reform, which means it's effective syncretism, which means it has totally impacted the church. That is what we don't want. You don't want to bring a culture from the society and influence the church totally. This can lead to spiritual decline in the church, and we're going to talk more about that in future. Now this is an example of a transparent syncretism, which means you are bringing the society culture into the church, but it's not having any impact on the church. There are some society culture you can bring to the church. For example, language. God is the one that created languages. So if you bring your own language into the church, it doesn't have impact. It doesn't create any spiritual decline in the church. So language is an example of a transparent syncretism. Music can be transparent and it can be solid. I mean, you can bring music into the church which doesn't belong to any specific culture, society culture, and you bring it to the church, so you can still not have any impact. The only thing you can say is that society culture bringing it to the church is either is transparent or is solid. That is totally impacting the church, or is transparent. It's negative or transparent. Bringing society culture into the church cannot be positive. It can be transparent, but it cannot be positive. Missionary reforms, that's the one we want to learn. Missionary reform, again, you see, the one I'm showing here, you see the reform is coming from the church. Look at the direction of the arrow. The reform is coming from the church and it's going to the society. You see that the overlap there, the overlap is still red, is still the society culture, which means that church reform in this case is not effective. It's a transparent church missionary reform. A transparent missionary reform, that is what Paul called conformity. That's when you conform to the society. Your reform doesn't have any impact at all. It doesn't make any change. For example, during the time of slave trade, you see that the church were carrying Bibles, but they were using it to actually trade in slave. That is a transparent. It doesn't have any impact on the society at all. It doesn't change the society culture. And we don't want that kind of reforms where you conform to the society. Because the Catholic that time, they conform to the Islamic jihad slave trade. So they were doing the same thing in order, although they were trying to prevent the spread of Islamism, but it didn't. That's not what the Bible wants us to do. But the type of missionary reforms we need is this. You see, the church is going to the society and is bringing the light to the society. So look at the overlap. That's a solid missionary reform, and that's what we're going to call reformation. So we call it missionary reformation because whenever you go to the society and you make impact, is solid light into the society. That is what Christ wants us to do. We're going to talk more about all these types of reforms. Again, I said we can have a total of 12. And the one we're going to focus more is the missionary reformation, which we're going to talk more about in the future. Thank you for listening.